For joining today, Emily and Kevin.
Hi.
Hi, yeah, happy to be here.
Yes,
Awesome.
definitely.
Well, this is an interesting conversation, one that, I chatted with Emily the other week on the grief journey and, our experiences that we'd been through individually. And Kevin, you have another journey that you've kind of been on. So I'm really looking forward to diving into this. But maybe as a jumping off point, if you both want to introduce yourselves and a little bit about your background and experience with, death and grief or the appreciation of life, I think that's a really great place to start. And I'll share a little bit more about myself and She's Independent in just a bit.
Okay.
Ladies first.
Oh, okay. All right. My name is Emily. My experience with death has been my husband, Ian, passed away from cancer about a year ago, just over a year ago. He was 32 years old and left me with 2 kids under the age of 5. So it's been a crazy journey for sure. It's definitely like my worst nightmare coming true and living through that experience. But throughout the journey, I've been able to find the light in all of the darkness, and it's opened my eyes up to just gratitude and life, and understanding me and what my wants and desires are and what my identity really is all about. I've also started a new business along the journey called Move Through, which helps anyone who's lost someone special in their lives cope with grief through exercise. So that's, I guess, kind of my background with the life-death life cycle, and I'm excited to get into this discussion more.
Awesome. Thanks so much for sharing. And Kevin?
Yeah, so my name is Kevin Carton. I am a life mastery consultant, and my experience with this death life cycle in my life is a lot of my own ego deaths. I've changed so much over the last 7 years, and so I look at this in a more personal, we have deaths in our own lives, like while we're living.
Mm-hmm.
And I've experienced that so many times in my life, and each time it's very similar, where there's that grieving of that old part of ourselves that we had held on to for so long and actually served us for a certain amount of time. And there's that process that happens there that I'd love to dive into with this. But then on top of that, I've also had some experiences in my family's life, like my brother. It attempted it was an attempt on his life. Thank you, Natalie. We're going to talk about that.
Yeah.
And so that is just like the appreciation of life for what it is right now, and knowing that also, even in death, there still is life, because it's just a transition, a phase change, an energy shift, which is something I want to define as well. So just had a lot of different experiences in my life.
Yeah, and you both have such different backgrounds. I think it's really interesting. I also have a background that I guess stems from death, or the experience of dealing with loss. In the last 17 months, I've lost 2 direct family members to suicide, which was really awful. First, my mom, and then one of my cousins, who was only 17. And I've also, through the experience and the journey, found the light and connected spiritually in ways, and learned a lot about appreciating this life and, experiencing the light and the darkness, but seeing the beauty in that contrast. So we have 3 really, kind of unique experiences and perspectives, and I'm really thankful to, be here having the conversation and diving into these concepts. Quickly, a little bit on me. I'm Natalie Levy. I started She's Independent within, months really of after losing my mother. And we have this kind of underlying, how do you have a healthy mindset? And empowerment can mean a lot of things, but at the core of it, it's a lot of, confidence and, love and appreciation for ourselves. And given the society we live in, there is a personal, or there is a professional angle. So we have the constructs of finance. So we might talk about things like personal finance or real estate. We do a lot of kind of individual, I'd call it inner work. So mindfulness and community and connection, and truly appreciating what we're doing, and grounding and meditation. We can get into that a bit more later. But yeah, this is a concept and a conversation that's really important to me given the experiences I've gone through. So thank you again. And that was for the intros, but maybe to start diving in, and I know you already touched, both of you, on some concepts that are pretty interesting. Let's talk about what is the life, death, life cycle, which is, the title and the topic today. How do you kind of think about it? How do you define it? I know already Emily mentioned, she's been touched by death. And so it's been kind of maybe a rebirth through that. Kevin, maybe it's not so much the death, but the life cycles that we're just going through in these rebirths. So maybe get a little bit more into, how do we go through these rebirths? It's interesting. Sometimes it's because of actual death, and sometimes it's death of some of ourselves. So I don't know, maybe Kevin, if you even want to kick that off, since it's kind of not actual death, but a different type and form of death, maybe speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it is and it isn't, because like you were saying, maybe it's not actual death, but remember, like, I want to define death first, how I see it. And actually, I mean, how I see it, but it's the truth. And both in the physical deaths of like people that are transitioning on, but then in our own energy, because again, I mentioned that it's just an energy shift. Like, you think of our bodies, like they're made up of atoms, that make up molecules, and then tissues, organs, all these different things. And it's just energy. And when someone passes away, like, their body is still there, but we don't say, or I mean, we say like John is gone, but John's body is right there. So what shifted was the energy. It's that transition from that person, that spirit being there and then not. And so then how I see it with then ourselves in, while we're alive, that there are times that we let go of things that are no longer us. And so in a way, it is actual death in terms of how it really is, that it's the energy that is being released and let go of. And so that's just how I see it. And so then, like, it's, well, how do we do this? Like, how do we do this well? Because that's just a part of life throughout life. And how I see we do it well is we accept it as it is, as challenging as that may be. And I know that y'all talked about grief a couple weeks ago, and that's a big topic, that like we need to allow ourselves to feel around these things. And that's okay to feel, like sad or depressed or upset or angry or just all these different emotions. Like, it's a wide range, and we're supposed to experience all in this range of being a human. So I think that's just where we start.
It's so interesting the way you talk about it. I mean, I might say, even with Emily and I, it was almost like a forced transition when you go through a death. Whereas I think there's this acceptance and this being open to transitions that are almost our own making, or our decisions to say intentionally, I'm going to steer and I'm going to try this other path. Whereas death, it's like, all right, now you have to make a decision, or you have to either accept and grow, or, crumble up, or whatever it is. It is interesting, that kind of, you're making these transitions. I mean, I would say to Emily, I don't know if you've read, for example, the Clarissa Pinkola book, Women Who Run with the Wolves. It's all about this archetype of the wild woman and these basically life transitions that women go through. And I'm sure every gender goes through it, but these kind of, it's almost like these every 7-year cycles. It's like we go through this big transition, becoming a woman, or, figuring out who we are and stepping away from, I don't know, the kind of shadow of our mother. I mean, there's all these different growth and transitions kind of integrated into our lives. How do you think about those life transitions?
Oh, 100%. I mean, for me, like, Ian's death definitely forced me into a place where I really had to look within and figure out, like, what am I supposed to do with my life? Because in a lot of ways, and I'm realizing now, I have just been checking off the boxes in my life that I've been trained to check off, right? Like, I got a job, I got married, I started a family, I stayed at home, I became a mom. And as soon as Ian died, it's like, that is all gone. I mean, it really, like, it didn't feel the same to me. So I really had, like, just being a mom without my husband and staying at home, I needed to figure out how to make money on my own, do all of these different things. And the only place for me to start was to really look within and say, okay, what is important to me? Not like, what have I been taught? What has, like, my mom told me? Really, like, what is important to Emily? And I had to go through this process of figuring out all of my values and trying to design this life that I want to live. And it's so interesting even now, like I still grapple trying to figure out, okay, like, is this something that I want, or is this something that society has somehow imposed on me, or that like I've been taught? And even in just relationships, like trying to date again, it's like I a lot goes back to like how we've been raised, and it's just insane how I feel like there's just been this huge awakening. But I think back to like Kevin's point too, as a society, we are so afraid of endings because we have this like fascination or desire for stability, consistency, peace, and calm. And all of those are perceived as good. But then the second you add disruption or change, a little bit of turmoil, it's like, oh, no, 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 we don't want any of that, right? But you're right. In order to kind of like move forward and hit these new chapters of life, you do need to kind of stop and shed the old. So I've grieved the loss of myself as a wife and as this like stay-at-home mom that I used to be. And that's been part of my grief journey, but it's also been really exciting, which you can feel guilty about too. Trying to step and discover who I really am, and that'll probably change again in another 6 months from now.
I'm so curious. You've gone through these life transitions because as a woman, it was getting married, having kids. I mean, those in and of themselves are transitions.
Oh,
but
yeah.
If I'm hearing correctly, I might say that this transition post or through the grieving, it's almost a bigger transition where you've done more of this maybe inner work. Is that fair to say?
100%. Because when I became a mom, I was obsessed. Like I totally was full on into the new mom mode, everything about it, just loving it. But I wasn't really thinking about it. I was just kind of going through the motions. Whereas this has been such a change where it really, like, I just was left with nothing. Like my whole world fell apart. So I had to say, okay, how do I want to rebuild this? How do I want to design my life? It wasn't as prescribed. So.
Yeah. And by the way, Kevin, feel free. You guys can ask each other questions. I figured I just do a little bit, but this is really, really interesting stuff. So thanks for sharing that. Yeah. I mean, I would share also, having been through and experienced death, I definitely did the inner work, took a step back. I think like a lot of people in quarantine today, we now are given the space and time. And after I lost my mother, it was left my job, decided to move. I mean, really it was, what do I want? And when you get to a point of, let's call it, I don't know if it's extreme sadness or you're kind of in the dark and you're figuring out, how do I grow or how do I get through this? It's almost this more focused view into what do I need and what do I want, which there's so much noise in the day-to-day, it's really hard to get there. I think this quarantine gives people a little bit more of that space to say, well, what is life?
Right.
Even something that you said before, which was, I think Emily, you said it, which was like, you were just kind of living, but then what do you truly want? I think there's this concept, and Kevin, I'm sure you could speak to this. A lot of people are living in almost a state of death, right? They're not really making decisions for themselves. They're going to work, they're coming home, they're maybe not even happy with their relationship with themselves or with their partner. But it's really interesting, right? Like, what is death, right? Arguably, a lot of people living aren't truly living. What is living? How do we appreciate, this life? I don't know if anybody wants to speak to that at all.
Yeah, I'll speak to it really quick, because what you're talking about, like, I think it's just fascinating, because like when people think of death, again, going back to that concept, is like the ending of life as what most people define it as like you're conscious, like you're in your body, you're alive. But what you're talking about, which I think is so true, is that most people aren't really feeling alive in the life that they're living. And so they are living sort of in a dead experience. And so my definition of life is what each of you were talking about, like the questions that you asked yourself after the experience that you had of someone passing away in your life, is that it's like, well, what do I really want? What makes me come alive? What would I love? Mm-hmm. That question I ask all of my clients, which is, what would you love? that's a very different question than what do you think that you want to do, or what do you think that is possible, or what does society or the economy say? Anything like that, like that's a very different question, and therefore you get a very different answer. But when you start to answer that question, like you were sharing, it's hard because like there's so many like, you know, conditions and conditioning and like programming from like your past. It's like, well, what do I want? And that I struggle with that very early on in my life, or earlier on than most people, I would say, because I went to school to get my doctorate in pharmacy, and I'm very grateful that I became aware of the path that I was taking and realized that I didn't want to be a pharmacist. Like truly, if I imagined my life, you know, what I would be doing 5-10 years from when I was in college, I didn't feel more alive. Like I wasn't like, oh my gosh, I can't wait to sit behind, you know, a counter in CVS pharmacy and dispense pills. Like that wasn't exciting to me at all. It just, you know, would make me good money. It was prestigious, and I chose that path. Like, you know, so I had to let go of a lot of those concepts, those ideas. And that was a lot of like, you know, letting that part of my life die to then make a decision to transition. Right. So that was more conscious, but a lot of us are thrust into these questions, which I believe is life like urging us to discover these questions for ourselves. And sometimes we choose it, sometimes we don't, but at least like become aware of those questions to ask ourselves.
Kevin, I have a question for you, because I feel like there's so many people that are stuck in the dead end job or the relationship that's been lasting forever and it needs to change, but they just don't, because we are so afraid of making these major shifts. We like to be comfortable. So like, what advice would you provide to someone, or how, I mean, I guess for all of us, like how can we open everyone's eyes to just realize, like, as painful as this loss has been, it's brought so much more fulfillment and gratitude into my day-to-day life. So I would just hope that we could share that with other people, right?
Mm-hmm. So what's your question exactly?
What advice would you be to help people kind of stop and say, okay, like this is my life and I've got one shot at it, and I might need to make a change, scary as that might be.
Yep. There's one question that I'd ask, and I encourage everyone to ask this. And this is really what, like, if I go down to the foundational level of what caused me to make that change and decide to not continue to get my doctorate and do something else, was I asked myself, when I get to the end of my life, so going back to mortality here, like the death, like when I'm on my deathbed and I look back at my life at this moment in time, like what would I be most proud of? What decision would I be most proud of right now? Mm-hmm. And then just answer that. And the answer is honestly, like, it's so easy when you get it that clear. It's like, well, of course I would make the decision that is scary, but I would really love to do. But then like, it just gets clear cut. Like you don't worry about all of the like, oh, how am I going to make money? Or is this responsible? Or what are people going to think? Like all of that just falls away, because decades later, that shit's not going to matter. It never does really, but in the moment it seems like it matters because they're facts of our life. But so when you take it full, like really far out, it's like, well, when I'm dying, like when I look back, it's like, how am I going to think about this time?
Right. That makes sense.
Yeah, that's definitely something I've done as well. And listen, I was caught up in it. I was making a bunch of money working on Wall Street, but I knew I wasn't happy with that path. And it was, okay, well, I'm on the path for now, and then I can make the decision later. But why is it always later? You know, what are we doing for ourselves now, and how are we nourishing ourselves? And there are a lot of exercises and a lot that we can do in terms of inner work to better align with that underlying, what do I really need and what do I really want? Mm-hmm. A lot of times I think it's more maybe workshops or working with other people that are more awakened or, you know, open to the ideas of consciousness. But one exercise I did recently, which I really, really enjoyed, was this meditation that was led by this really interesting woman locally. We're in Colorado, by the way, the three of us. And the concept was, you know, listening to the inner voice, where we kind of have this wounded inner self, or this, let's say, part of us that, or this something that we kind of hate, but it's a part of us and we need to accept that. So I actually did multiple of these workshops, 2 different people led them, in really interesting stuff, and realizing that to really empower myself and to really be aligned with what I needed and wanted, it was stop running from or fighting this, basically what is you, and really accepting all of you and digging into what drives you. And those inner voices, not hushing and quieting, but listening. Why am I telling myself that? Where is this coming from? And, let me work with it. That's been something that I've really enjoyed on my journey of kind of enlightenment or empowerment, and realizing, how should I be aligned, and what is my life calling?
I love that. And I love, so one way I feel like of trying to differentiate, like what have I been trained versus what do I want is, and I think I got this from Mark Groves, where he said, like, if something feels uncomfortable, don't avoid it. Like, that's when you want to lean into it and say, okay, why am I feeling this way? And then you get an answer. Yeah. And then you ask another, well, why this? And you just keep going and going and going until you're like, oh my God, that's because my dad raised me to, get good grades all the time, or whatever it may be. But it's just really fascinating once you stop and just take a chance to ask yourself the questions and truly listen. And I'm reading Untamed right now by Glennon Doyle. Have you guys heard of it? Anyway, she has this, she calls it the knowing. And it's all of us have our own knowing. And it's just being still and quiet enough to listen. So it's cool.
Like, we are our best teachers, and the best people, the most trained, and Kevin, does coaching. I mean, I often hear that, and it's like the journey of coaching, or let's say you're working with a therapist or a psychiatrist. I mean, they're basically the good ones. They're getting it out of you, but it's in you, right? It's somebody's helping you maybe with that journey. But yeah,
Oh yeah. Coaching is amazing. I need coaching to like get me there.
Awesome. And listen, I mean, I love what we're talking about. I think I'd love it if we explored even a little bit more of death, because it is something, and Kevin, I know you've mentioned this, we kind of shy away from it. We don't necessarily want to talk about it. It is this very dark, black subject, but there's this beauty to the acceptance. And if you can get to that light beyond it, there's something so beautiful there. So maybe let's talk about that a little bit. Let's talk about the actual death and the dying, and why is it so important that we're accepting this? And we can talk about that spiritual journey and even a little bit more of that grief journey that Emily and I touched on before, but let's talk about death.
Yes. I mean, for me, it's funny because now death is something that I like only talk about. I feel like all I do is talk about grief and dying and terminal illness. But when Ian first got diagnosed with cancer, he got diagnosed, and at first people reached out and sent their condolences, but people just really don't know what to say to someone who is facing that and how to interact or support. So I think it's really important that we're having the conversation and showing that death doesn't have to be, yes, I think we need to allow ourselves to grieve and feel the pain and the hurt of dying. But at the same time, there's such this like dark stigma around it, and the focus is only on the pain sometimes, that even when you are moving forward, you feel guilty about experiencing joy or experiencing the beauty of this rebirth in other ways. So I think, the more we can shed light on the subject of acceptance and what comes after is great. It's doing people a huge service.
Yeah. And in other cultures, I mean, people are celebrating via the funeral, or, on a day of the year, the Day of the Dead. I mean, there's other cultures that do appreciate and accept, and it's almost like there's a vibrancy and this, love and these amazing kind of things and gifts around death. And it here in the Western world, we're very against that, let's say, and we don't talk about it.
Right.
Kevin, I don't know if you want to, speak to it as well, but basically the acceptance of why is it important to accept death and to talk about it.
Yeah, I have a question for you, Emily, because, and Natalie, I would love to hear your perspective on this too, because death has been so recent for each of you in the last couple of years in your immediate life. Because what I think about, and what I think is the underpinning of like what you're both are talking about, is that it doesn't have to be just all focused on the bad. Is that there's a law called the Law of Polarity, and it's just as real as the law of gravity or the law of electricity. It's invisible, but it's always at work. The law of polarity states that there is an equal and opposite to everything. And so there's good, there's bad, there's light, there's dark, there's up, there's down, there's hot, there's cold, and it goes on. So in this case, like we're talking about death, what you're both are sharing, it's like the focus, at least in the Western world, is very much on the darkness of it. So I'm curious, in each of your experience, like what is the light? Like, I know, Emily, you said like it comes after, but I would venture to say that it actually is throughout, it can be throughout the entire experience. Mm-hmm. Like, so what was that experience for each of you, like finding that light?
No, you're totally right. And I love the law of polarity and bringing that into the death experience. I think you're absolutely right. There was a quote that I pulled the other day or a week ago. It said, you can't experience profound joy until you experience profound like sadness or pain or something. And I 100% agree. I think I was lucky, and I don't know, it's hard to say to qualify the experience, but the fact that Ian had a terminal illness and he was diagnosed all the way back in 2011. And so we kind of had this like, okay, life is precious mentality from a very long time ago, but it didn't really hit us until his cancer metastasized. And that was about 15 months before he actually died. So in that time, it was hard because it was this state of limbo, which we're all experiencing right now during quarantine and the pandemic. Like, when are we going to return back to normal? But at the same time, it was like, okay, if this is the last couple of months, not knowing what tomorrow is going to bring or what this next new treatment is going to bring, how can we make the most of our time? And that in itself was a beautiful thing. Ian and I did some amazing things with our family and just with the two of us. And we really did try to make the most of our time. But for me, like, I think the acceptance part of him dying and me having to stop and make such a pivot on my life, like that really did come more afterwards for me. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Because I think in a lot of ways I was still denying that this would ever happen. Although the odds of him beating this were so small, I was like, no, he's gonna make it. Like, we're gonna be that one statistic that beats this.
Mm.
Yeah, I resonate. A lot of that resonates with me. I mean, I would say that I'll walk through my experience of kind of the death and the post-death, but I will say that I've learned a lot about the lightness and the darkness in ourselves and in living, and couldn't agree more that there's this kind of beauty, and it exists within life and within death. I mean, it exists everywhere. In the acceptance of and the appreciation and the contrast, I mean, that is life. And even now, post experiencing these deaths, when I hear people say like, you need to experience the sadness, and you need, like, basically by really living and even feeling sadness, that's living, right? Like, there's this appreciation in going through the tough things because you can truly grow from it. But you won't appreciate the happiness if you don't have the sadness. Yeah, I have so many thoughts on that, but I will speak a little bit to that experience of death because, listen, I went through now 2 suicides in my family where there's so many layers, and there's so much darkness and so much of it could be the what if and what could we have done and all of this. But what I will tell you, and this blows my mind still when I say it, but it's so true. With my mom, it took many, many months to even get to a place of feeling some kind of peace and connectedness to her post-death. With my cousin, there was still the extreme sadness and the shock and all of that. But within a week, I was feeling connected to him spiritually and feeling appreciation for kind of his life and connecting to him. I mean, it was unbelievable. And I think part of that was just the being openness and the acceptance of what is death and how do we connect post-death. And I'm happy, by the way, to chat about this one-on-one. I'm happy to go into it in detail. And we only have so much time today, but basically, sorry, that's my dog clearly wanting to be involved. That acceptance of and that feeling of the deep grief and the deep sadness is just a part of the journey. And it's almost like you're developing these muscles or developing these new pathways in your brain to say, what is death? And then when you get to that place of acceptance, which could take months or years or days, or I don't know, depending on the person and the journey, but you can get to this place of beauty and peace and spiritual connectedness. Now, when I go out in nature and I see robins or sunflowers or the moon, I mean, it is this gratitude and this feeling of them, and their presence.
I agree totally with that.
It's a really kind of beautiful thing. And it's something that I think is more maybe something somebody experiences after losing somebody to death. But I still think that you can appreciate that lightness and the darkness, in the everyday life. But death really brings it out, let's say.
Sounds like it's an amplifier.
Yeah.
If you allow it.
Sure. Yeah.
That's the thing. It's like what you were sharing, it was fascinating when you were sharing, it's like that with your mom, it took a couple of months. And then with your cousin, it was only a week. Like, and you're sharing again, like developing that spiritual muscle. Like what I thought of it when you were sharing that is that like, it's just within us, like our own conditioning of like, how connected can we feel and how much are we opening to that? Cause I would imagine like there is an experience, and I'm sure there are people who have experienced this that maybe have developed themselves at a certain level. And I can't say because I'm not that type, I'm not that person. I haven't experienced that, but that where someone can pass away and then literally there's no lag time in terms of a connection with them.
Yeah.
Because again, going back to the definition of death, which I know when I was sharing, like you both were like nodding your head that you agree that it's just an energy transition. So that person is still there. And I know when I was younger, like my parents would say this all the time because I lost all of my grandparents before I was 15. And every single time, like I didn't understand it at that time because I was so young, but every single time they said, they're still with us. And I thought they were, that they're just saying that to make us all feel better. But it's actually true because energy is never, like this is a physics principle, is a scientific principle that energy cannot be destroyed or even created. It just transitions. So it's just a matter of how can we, connect.
Yeah.
I would love to go into that discussion a little bit more if you're up for it, you guys, Natalie and Kevin, because I feel like I'm very new to the whole conversation on spirituality. I definitely was not religious before I lost Ian, and losing him has opened my eyes into the whole spiritual realm. I'm still just exploring it. But I told Natalie on our last call that I talked to a medium on the day of his 1-year death anniversary. And it was just insane how connected I felt to him, and how much she knew. And I still waver sometimes. I want to be open, but then I also start worrying about negative energy and spirits. And so I'd just love to hear your thoughts on that.
Natalie, you want to share first?
Yeah, I'm unmuting because my dog is getting excited by this conversation. By the way, dogs do feel energy. It's interesting. Like I've become spiritual since experiencing loss, but I was open to it. And I think I'm working on and developing more of that muscle to Kevin's analogy. But for me, it's been this kind of peaceful connectedness, feeling presence of, these people that we've lost, but also realizing that they're a part of us. So not just that their energies, I do feel them kind of around, and I feel them in certain ways, like speaking to me with signs or just feeling their presence. But I also think that they become a part of us. I don't see boundaries in terms of, to your question, I don't see like the negative. And granted, I haven't gone into, witchcraft or things that they say you need to be more careful about. But for me, I've really enjoyed deepening my spiritual journey and connectedness, and I want to continue to explore that. But I have heard that when you're working with a medium, somebody connecting with the dead, you need to be careful and you want to make sure that you're in a good place. And I would actually make that point in everyday life, which is if you're doing a deep spiritual practice, for example, deep breath work. We do conscious breath work at She's Independent. It's one of the modalities. And you basically are going into your consciousness. And you don't want to, whether you're doing, let's say, medicinal mushrooms, or you don't want to do these things if you're not in a good place. I would think that also transfers to connecting with death or going deeply into these other realms, because what you have in your energy and your intention, that is a part of the experience. So you need to go in with those kind of, I don't want to call them boundaries, but with a good mindset, because what we're willing is kind of what is happening. So if you're feeling very negative or very broken, I mean, that could really hurt and harm the experience and what you take away from it. So Kevin, yeah, feel free if you want to jump in there.
Yeah, I mean, going back to the law of polarity, there's always going to be light and a dark. Like we experience like literally life by the contrast. Like the only reason we know we're alive is we have an idea of what being dead is like. And so there's of course that those energies in the universe, but like to the point you were sharing, Natalie, is like if you're in a right mindset as you go into these more deeper realms and like explore this yourself, then you're going to be fine, because we attract who we are, not what we want or what we're thinking of. It's who we are, and who we are is in our energy and how we feel and what we are really connected with. And so fear, if we have some bits of fear of it, that's who we are being. So it's like working on just like, okay, like I hear you, that fear about it all, but just like I'm not allowing you in my like my house, my consciousness house. I imagine that it's like fear is knocking on the door and like I don't let them in.
Yeah.
So yeah.
That concept you just said, I just have to for a second expound on it. I mean, it's so interesting, and I agree, right? You're attracting what you put out there or who you are. And even when it comes to relationships or how we think about ourselves, I mean, there's so much work that people can do there. How many times are people attracting something that's negative, but it's not that other thing that's the issue, it's you, right? Like you need to work on it, because if you're not loving yourself and if you don't have good energy, what are you attracting? So I think that applies in many realms, whether it's the subconscious and death or spirituality or the living, waking life, right, that we're experiencing.
Totally. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think these are such great concepts. I love, what we're talking about. And listen, we've been on the call for a little bit. This will be a recording. I know a few people kind of popped in, popped out. We will make it accessible. Is there anything that we haven't touched on before we open it up to see if anyone has questions? Is there any concept or anything that you want to put out there? I know we've covered a lot of bases that you wanted to bring as you came and showed up today.
I think there's one other thing that I was thinking of in alignment with what we were talking about, because I know, Emily, you asked a question about, the whole spiritual realm, because you're just really getting into that over the last year or so. And I just wanted to share and this one principle, and not even a principle, it just is what it is, that goes along with this whole life cycle. Like the reason why this happens, like that death is not truly a death, it's a transition, is that there is just one life, one presence, one power, one energy, even call it God, call it spirit, the universe, infinite intelligence, whatever label that you want to use. There is this one power that is ever present. It is within and in everything in existence, including us. And so that goes along with like, that's why this cycle is always repeating, because life cannot never be destroyed. It just is. And then with the whole spiritual realm, like the reason why we can connect with people is because, again, there's life eternal for every single one of us. And, you hear that because I grew up Catholic. I never was like really religious, but I gained a lot of depth in terms of spirituality. And now like the last like year I've been coming around to religion and just picking out the truths rather than the dogma. And what I found is that not only in Catholicism, but literally every major religion touches on this, that there is this one power, one presence, one life, and that it's within all of us that we can all access. So just wanted to just throw that in there.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It's been a journey, guys.
Listen, there's so much we could talk about. I mean, Emily and I, when we chatted on Grief Journeys, like there's so much you can talk about when it comes to death, but I love that we've spoken about these concepts that are truly, big and beautiful, and it's about ourselves and living, right? It all is so connected, and you can experience death when you're alive. You experience life when you're dead. I mean, it really is truly a cycle.
Mm-hmm.
It truly is. And I'm just thinking like, for the people right now that are going through loss with COVID and just, daily people are dying. it's been interesting to me to see the timeline. Like you said, for your mom, it took you months, then your cousin a week. But I think trying to introduce these concepts to someone who is grieving, timing is really important, because I think like trying to force or introduce the beauty and the light before they're able to fully feel the darkness. It's like these people, I mean, in general, we need to all kind of arrive. It's all our own journey, right? But I wish there was a way to kind of just let people know that it is going to get better, or support them, or somehow like allow these concepts to comfort them without getting too defensive. Right?
Yeah.
Do you have any tips or for how to like support someone who is grieving?
I love what you said about it's everyone's own journey. And, Kevin probably has some thoughts on how to lead or how to be present without critiquing or, telling somebody. But it is really big, right? Because you need to feel and you need to experience the loss and the death and all these things, right? You can't just show up and it's like you're in the light. For me, I think one of the most important things, because the way that I lost people in my life, it was a more abrupt, more, it wasn't like we didn't plan or we didn't know. It was unexpected. It was an extreme loss where there was a trauma associated. So there's even deeper layers of like experiencing and getting through that tunnel of darkness. But for me, just hearing from others and having people that had experienced death, other people that experienced trauma, where there's light at the end of the tunnel. And it's not that they're saying, bask in the light and you're going to grow from this and you're going to feel peace, but like, it's going to get better.
Yeah, lean into it. And then,
yeah. Somebody said to me, and when they lost their father years ago, I guess they learned this concept and they shared it with me. And it's something that I would repeat to myself, which was, it's okay to be happy and sad at the same time. You can be sad and laugh. You can cry and be happy, and experiencing all of those feelings, like that's normal. And there is light at the end of this. I mean, just knowing that and talking to others who'd had similar experiences with suicide, for example, being in a suicide support group and talking to somebody who's had the exact same scenario, I lost a parent or I lost a sibling or whatever it is, by talking and connecting with people that had that not exact journey, but the same type of loss, it really is comforting.
Yes. Yeah, I agree.
So the only thing I'll add to that, with piggybacking on that, is just like you hit the nail on the head. It's like what I was thinking of it, like to your question, Emily, is that
Natalie, you're on mute. I don't know.
it's all good.
Someone's trying to connect with us.
Yeah.
Yeah,
You're
thanks
welcome.
for having us. Post it on when the link is up and we'll share it out. Oh yes. Thank you guys. Happy Friday.
Yes. Happy Friday.
Bye.
Bye.